Welcome, everyone, to the Over Under Movies podcast, where we take a prominent figure or franchise in the world of filmmaking and ask the simple question, are they overrated or are they underrated? I'm here, joined as always by my co-host, DeAngelis. Dylan, welcome.
Welcome. It's 2024. Is this the first podcast we've done in 2024, or we do one like really early in the year?
I think technically we did Street Fighter at the end of last year, so
Okay.
this is going to be our first recording in the new year.
This is also a flu game for you, for anybody listening to this. Wait, you've been sick for the last, week and a half
about
now?
a week, yeah. But we're back, full force. I took cough medicine, and I have chamomile tea, so we're good to go.
So what are we talking about in this podcast, Jason?
We're talking about Kingsman, the British franchise created by Mark Millar and Matthew Vaughn.
So we're doing this episode because Matthew Vaughn has a film coming out, next week called Argylle. We're going to be releasing this the week that Argylle comes out. And yeah, we're doing the whole franchise too for this episode, right? It's not just the first Kingsman movie. We're doing the three Kingsman films that have been released so far.
Yes, so there's Kingsman, The Secret Service, Kingsman, The Golden Circle, and
The Kingsman.
The Kingsman, which is a prequel to the other two movies. So this is a British spy action comedy franchise. Came out the comic that it's based on came out in 2012. Then the movie came out, I believe, in 2014.
That's crazy. Is Mark Millar the writer for the graphic novel series or for the comic series?
Yes.
So, yeah, because that's crazy fast turnaround to get adapted into a film series.
Yeah, they were working on the comic and the films at the same time. So this had been adapted even before the comic finished publishing.
Wow.
For people not familiar with Mark Millar, he's the creator of Kick-Ass. He wrote the original run of Marvel's Civil War story. He's a pretty prolific writer, but he's also a little bit divisive. People find him to be a little bit tasteless. A lot of people didn't like that Civil War run, so he's an interesting guy.
And interestingly, Matthew Vaughn did the Kick-Ass movie as well. So is this a case of where Mark Millar was like, hey, you did a good job in my other movie. Hey, do you want to do this one too?
Yeah, I think they've just been friends for a while, and they kind of like each other's stuff. Mark Millar is well known for being hyper violent in his comic books. I think he also did Old Man Logan. And then Matthew Vaughn likes to take that violence and kind of make it look more theatrical and colorful. So I think they're a good pairing together. They call each other now when Mark Millar wants to get a movie done. He calls up his buddy Matthew Vaughn.
And what's the studio that does these films?
I'm not sure.
Is this Warner Brothers or Lionsgate? I'm not sure. It's an interesting question because from my standpoint, at least, I'm the overrated one for this podcast. By the way, everybody, we'll get to those later, but. The first thing that struck me, because I had never watched these movies before until we decided we were going to do this for the podcast, and the first thing that jumped out to me was that this really feels to me like a studio that is trying to artificially create a franchise where one doesn't exist.
Well, that's essentially what happened, right? When they made this comic book, they were we're making this to turn it into a movie and then hopefully a movie franchise. So, yeah, it wasn't based off a long, beloved comic or anything like that. They optioned this immediately to turn into a movie.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, the first one came out, 2015, right?
2014.
2014. And it was fairly successful box office-wise. It's successful enough where they were like, okay, we're just going to give the green light to all of these films. You had seen these before, right? I mean, is this a film franchise that you think that you like the movies, or what are your thoughts overall on them?
Yeah, I saw the first one. I got an early release to it, and I was like, wow, this is great. This is a spy movie I haven't seen before. It's fun and exciting. It feels almost like a superhero movie. It kind of fits that same formula of the fun Marvel movies, except it's for spies. So I thought it was great. And then I heard the second one was bad, and I never ended up seeing it, even though I do have a lot of love for the first one. And then the third one, the prequel, I watched the first hour of and turned it off until we finished watching
until we watched the full thing last week.
Yeah, so my connection to this is tenuous at best, but I do love that first one. I remember for my basic editing final, I had to make a video set to music, and I set Kingsman: The Secret Service to the song Popular from Wicked, and I got an A. So, thank you, Kingsman.
So I watched them for the first time when we just watched them for the podcast. I gotta say, kind of underwhelming overall. They do feel like popcorn movies, despite the fact that the central conceit of the film seems fairly interesting. The idea of a secret spy service that is going around the world and doing like espionage shit. I mean, this is not a new idea for a story. James Bond movies are like the oldest, one of the oldest movie franchises ever. They've been doing James Bond films for the longest time, and this really does feel like a Marvel version of a James Bond franchise, essentially.
Yeah, so the main thing that sets this apart from like James Bond, Mission Impossible, is that the spy movies that we have and we're familiar with, they all follow these like established middle-aged men spies. And this one's more about like a kid stepping into that role. You know, he goes through the training in the school. It's almost like a Harry Potter-esque adaptation of a spy franchise. So the main character being young, I think plays a big part in like what makes this different than other spy franchises. When Mark Millar and Matthew Vaughn came up with this idea together, they said that they wanted to do this because they thought that the Casino Royale Bond movie was going to be more like this, more of an origin story for James Bond. And then when they saw it and it wasn't that, they were inspired to make their own spy franchise.
I mean, do you think that this film series is carried by, what's his name, Eggsy, Taron Egerton's character? Like, how much of this franchise is him and this film series being about like the origin of like this great spy versus how much of it is the ensemble cast? Because there's just like a shitload of really famous actors that are in these movies.
Well, I think the main character, Eggsy, is really, I find him to be very compelling. He's like charismatic, he's kind and caring, and he's coming up working class or even poor and joining this elite gentleman's group for spy stuff. And seeing that, I like him a lot as a main character, especially in that first film. I feel like by the second film, they kind of focus on him less to just like tell the story. So I feel like they shift away from like the character study of Eggsy and just go into another adventure. But initially, I think he's a really great protagonist that's carrying the franchise on his back.
Yeah, because it reminds me of a lot of other first films and film franchises where the formula is pretty tried and true at this point, where you take a character that's like the fish out of water and you throw them into this like completely unknown world. And because the main character is basically serving as like the audience's avatar, you know, the audience is learning about all these new things as the main character is learning all these things. It works really well. One film that I can think of that does this perfectly is Men in Black, where Will Smith is being introduced to this whole world, and you're kind of like going on that journey with him. And by the end of that film, you know, he's developed into an MIB agent. And that's kind of what the Kingsman does here, is that by the end of the first movie, yeah, he's kind of done. And not even by the end of the first movie, it's by like the third act of the first movie, he is just immediately amazing at fighting and using all of the tech, and he's like perfect at everything.
Yeah.
He really is. He's kind of, I mean, I don't know, but he's kind of like a Mary Sue character a little bit. He kind of doesn't mess up ever in these movies, outside of accidentally hooking up with a chick at a music festival in the second movie because he has to.
Yeah, that's his one weakness, is being too good at seduction.
He's too good at hooking up with women in very James Bondian fashion. When I was watching through these movies, I couldn't help but wonder, like, how much better would these films be if it was Tom Holland and not Taron Egerton? Like, Tom Holland is so charming and charismatic, and he does like, if you look at the Spider-Man movies, he does such a good job at seeming like aloof and like open-minded and being like cast into that role of somebody with a lot of responsibility and having to, you know, protect the ones around him. And when I look at Taron Egerton, he's just a guy. He just feels like, I feel nothing watching him. The best scenes in this series are when Colin Firth is on screen, or like when Mark Strong's on screen, when these older actors are there to kind of like lift things up a bit. I think those are always the best sequences in these movies. And that's why I asked the question at the beginning here, because it does feel like a film series that, if it's going to succeed long term, I think it's going to work better as an ensemble than focusing specifically on the main guy like it has.
Well, I would disagree. I think that Taron Egerton does a very good job in this role. I think he's just as charming and capable as Tom Holland. I think he just doesn't get a lot to work with, especially from the second movie on. But in the first one, like, there's a good amount of stuff that he has to do. Like, he has to be a loving son that's caring for his mother, who's in an abusive relationship. He has to be this fish out of water character, like you described. And then he has to be a suave, cool, badass spy. And he does all of those things really well. I do agree that moving forward, the franchise kind of has to rely on its ensemble, especially like with the second movie, which is not as good as the first one and generally isn't very well received. The parts of it that still work are just the fact that you see these different celebrities show up and they're playing these wacky characters or wacky versions of themselves. Like in the second movie, Elton John is basically a main character. He gets kidnapped by the villain and then has to help the good guys overtake the bad guys' lair by the end of it, and he's singing and having a good time the whole time.
Yeah, and that's probably the most interesting conversation to have about this film franchise is these movies are really camp. They're really silly at the core of them. And that's the main difference between this series and the James Bond series. Is the James Bond series is very adult centric, I would say.
Well, yeah, the Daniel Craig Bond series.
Yeah, specifically, and like the family that owns the estate to the James Bond like stories, that's what they're going for. They're targeting older viewers with their movies, and when it comes to like the villains and their interactions with James Bond, like it's all fairly serious. They're being realistic. They're at least trying to be realistic with this stuff. I don't think that is the goal of the Kingsman movies. And the question is like, do Matthew Vaughn and the actors, do they know that they're in a silly movie, or do they think they're in a movie that's like highbrow a little bit that's also silly? Do they think that they're like hitting that like MCU balance?
It's
with their
interesting
movies?
because I feel like in the first two movies, they know that they're in a very silly movie and that like they're building a ridiculous world and it's supposed to be fun and cartoony on purpose. And then with that prequel, The Kingsman, it's a lot more drab and serious.
Yeah.
And they're talking about the horrors of war, and Ray Fiennes is reading Dulce Decorum Est over like sad war montages, and it's very, very serious.
Yeah, The Kingsman, the prequel movie that they made, what a fucking flex on their part to say, hey, we've made two movies. The second movie did not review very well. We're going straight into not just a prequel movie. I believe the goal is a prequel trilogy of these films.
Yeah.
It's basically like if the Harry Potter franchise, they tried making the Fantastic Beast films, like after the Chamber of Secrets movie came out. It's a giant risk because you're right, the tone is completely different in that prequel film. And this is the issue that you run into when you try to franchise too early. And that's my opinion of these movies in general, is that they seem to be trying to franchiseify it a bit too soon. And I don't know how much of that is coming down from the film studio, or is this Mark Millar and Matthew Vaughn being like super cocky and being like, hey, we've got the next James Bond series on our hands here. We're just going to make as many of these movies as we can. It's tough to speculate.
Yeah, I think with like a franchise like this, you kind of have to churn them out as fast as you can. Otherwise, people will lose interest. Like, I think we're seeing it now. There's not too much investment in these films at this point anymore because the second one came out like years ago. The third one was a prequel that nobody saw in theaters. But they are still like trying to move ahead with this franchise. And with Argylle that's coming out, apparently that ties into the Kingsman universe as well.
Yeah, the issue that I foresee with this franchise going forward is scaling. So the first movie is fairly contained to just England. However, Samuel L. Jackson is the main villain. It's like a world-altering tech virus thing that he's got. The Kingsmen have to stop. And then in the second movie, there's also this like worldwide,
Yeah.
like world-altering scale of a villain plot. And the second movie also extends into what are the American Kingsmen, or what are they called, the Statesmen. So that's an issue that they're going to run into here is like, how do you make it bigger? How do you raise the stakes movie to movie? And when you do what it seems like they're doing here, like it's almost like that's their plan, is to go like bigger and badder every movie. The one like good thing I have to say about this series is that the budgets are fairly low for the movies. They're all around like $100 million. However, I could foresee this in like 4 or 5 years being like, oh, this is a $300 million movie franchise, like per movie.
Yeah.
And like that's when you start running into trouble.
Yeah, and usually these budgets do have to balloon because to bring an actor back for like a third movie, you have to pay them a lot more money. Everyone expects more payment after a successful franchise. I think in terms of like scaling for plot, I don't really find that to be a big concern. Like if you look at the Mission Impossible series, those usually involve world-ending plots, and then they fix it, and then in the next one, it's a different world-ending plot, and they fix it.
Though it is funny that this movie franchise is like the opposite of the Mission Impossible franchise, where the villain's plot in the Mission Impossible movies is almost always irrelevant. Every Mission Impossible movie either has like a MacGuffin or like a world-ending device that is never explained,
Yeah.
and it's not important because the movie is good enough that they don't need to go full explainer mode in the third act to get you invested. And the Kingsman franchise is the complete opposite. The villain absolutely spells out like word for word what their plan is, what their intentions are, and what their political views are.
Yeah, yeah. They'll look directly into the camera and tell you. But I think it's kind of funny. It's like clearly they're supposed to be these cartoon villains. So I don't mind it that much. I'm not too concerned about scaling in terms of what's going on within that universe. I do think the budget could be a concern if they're making like another trilogy of these movies or creating this interconnected universe with Argylle. This is going to get expensive, and I don't know how sustainable that is either.
I'm also a little concerned because I don't know if Matthew Vaughn's a good director. X-Men First Class is good. It's not amazing. The movie like kind of falls apart in the third act.
I agree with that.
It's like a good setup of a movie, and like I don't know, Kick-Ass is kind of similar. It's like cool idea, it's based on a popular comic, and he does like a fairly good job with it. But is this the guy like we're handing the keys to this like enormous movie franchise to? And how many other franchises are like this where like one guy directs everything?
Yeah, not a lot. I think that's part of why I'm so interested in it is because, okay, this guy has the keys. He is the one who gets to drive the whole thing. Let's see how he does with it. As for whether he's a good director, that's an interesting question because it's almost like he's untested because the last 3 movies he's done has been these movies.
Yeah, he's done like an X-Men adaptation. He's done another Mark Millar adaptation.
Yeah.
He's done these movies. He hasn't done a lot.
He did Stardust, which is good, and then he produced the early Guy Ritchie films, so Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, which are both really good, very British movies. He definitely has talent as a producer, and I think he's pretty good at choosing projects. Maybe excluding these. This is still an experiment, I think. But he's definitely had a good, pretty prolific career. It's just that within the last decade, since this first movie came out in 2014, this is all that he's done. That's very interesting.
How many of these films are in development right now?
So the sequel to The Kingsman is in development, which will obviously follow the rise of Hitler.
Spoilers for the post-credit scene of The King's Man.
In The King's Man post-credit scene, Adolf Hitler is introduced like he's Thanos from the MCU.
It's Hitler with an infinity gauntlet.
It's insane. And then the sequel to Kingsman 2 is coming out. So there's 2 that are being like developed right now, and then that the Kingsman sequel is supposed to have another sequel. Like you said, it's a trilogy. So in total, there should be 2 full trilogies of Kingsman movies and the Kingsman movies. And then, of course, that ties into the Argylle cinematic universe. And Mark Millar has also said that he would like to see a Hit Girl versus Kingsman film in the future. So it could all tie together.
Yeah, you know that this is going to ultimately result in some sort of like multiverse film in 2035.
Only if they make money, which, like, by the track records of these films, the success keeps going down with the money. So The Kingsman did not make a ton of cash. So we'll see if they actually go all the way.
Despite the fact that that movie was one of the movie trailers that was playing before basically every movie that you would watch in theaters for a good like 8 months.
Yeah, they were really pushing for it to be successful. It was an interesting choice to make a prequel to this franchise, like you said.
Yeah, make it as serious as they made it. It really does feel like a completely different genre of film, and it's kind of like depressing too. It's a much like slower pace of a movie, and then like it gets into the Kingsman stuff like near the end of it. It kind of sneaks up on you.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Matthew Vaughn said that he didn't want to make a spy movie for the Kingsman. He wanted to make like a more classic adventure film, so like a globe-trotting, almost Indiana Jones type. And I think he succeeds in that to some level, but I don't think the movie is very good.
No, it's not, which is tough. It's a tough look when the first attempt to like expand your franchise a little bit, I mean, it fell in his fucking face. It made 125 on a $100 million budget. That's not good. The movie probably lost money.
Yeah, but it definitely gets that like COVID excuse. It came out while COVID was still a pretty big thing. and it was also, I believe it was released to like HBO Max almost the same like month or something.
So it's difficult to judge exactly what the
Yeah,
success of it was.
but still, like, if they make another movie and it's like that and it's at the same quality level, I don't see it making very much more money at the box office.
Yeah, I mean that's the nightmare is that if Kingsman 3 comes out and it makes like 200 million at the box office, and then you're like, oh, what do we do now?
I don't think they plan on doing more Kingsman besides the two trilogies and potential crossovers with other franchises. But if they are trying to like make this a forever franchise, I think they are going to struggle, and I think the only way they can do that is to keep the budget like at 100 million or under.
Like, do you find this franchise, like, if a movie's coming out for this franchise, would you be excited? When, like, are you like gearing up to go see Kingsman 3?
I would definitely see Kingsman 3 in theaters because even though I know the second one wasn't as good as the first one, I still enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I was like surprised because I had heard so many bad things about the second one. And then when I saw it for myself, I was like, oh, that was still pretty fun. It was similar to the first one. So I would see Kingsman 3. I like these movies. I like the action comedy, spy thriller genre. I think that there's a niche that these are filling for me that other movies are not. So, Dylan, what do you think these movies are rated in the public consciousness on a scale of 1 to 10?
It's difficult to say. So the Rotten Tomatoes scores are all over the place. The Metacritic scores are all over the place. I would say like this feels like a 6, like a solid 6. That's right on the threshold of rotten versus fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. I would almost guess that like this is exactly what this franchise is going for, which is good enough. I would say 6 out of 10.
It's definitely interesting because this is obviously a successful franchise to get 3 movies and then 2 more movies in active development. At the same time, I don't feel like people really talk about these movies anymore, and I don't think that they've been like critical smash hits or anything. So I'm right there with you at a 6. I think they sit at a very interesting place.
That's good. So our overrated, underrated argument here will be literally on the Rotten Tomatoes line. I don't know how many other episodes we've done where it's already on the Rotten Tomatoes line. So like me saying that they're overrated means that I'm arguing for Rotten side, and then underrated is
Basically,
fresh
yeah.
side. It's nice and easy, real clean.
Yeah. So you're arguing that this is overrated. Go ahead. What do you got?
Okay, so so the overrated argument for me basically comes down to the fact that I think this franchise has peaked already. It's a franchise that peaked in its first movie, which is not unheard of in movie history. But if you just look at the raw numbers, the first film made 414 million at the box office. The second one made 410, which is good, and then the prequel fell on its face, 125. If you look at the Rotten Tomatoes scores, 75%, 50%, 41%. If you look at the Metacritic scores, first one had 60, 44, 44. All 3 had a B plus cinema score, though, which is not a good cinema score. It's like average. So this is a franchise that appears to have really peaked with the first movie. People probably saw that first movie like, wow, this is really cool, fun little story. And then Matthew Vaughn and Mark Millar are like, oh, wow, you guys like it a lot, huh? We're going to make like 6 more of these things. We're going to just churn these out like as many as possible. And they just, they didn't read the room. They took the wrong lesson from that. And this is just a Hollywood thing in general. I don't know if it's not specifically these guys' fault.
Yeah.
I mean, this is how you got to do it. You have one movie that like pops off, and you got to see like how long you can ride that horse for. When you compare this to the other movie franchises that we've been talking about in this podcast, it's really interesting. So the Mission Impossible films and the James Bond films are both PG-13 rated. The Kingsman movies, I believe, are all rated R, right? So it kind of puts them like a step back a little bit. They're like playing on hard mode almost with these movies. We talked about earlier that this almost feels like MCU spy movies. The MCU films are PG-13. They're meant for a younger audience. So I think they're having a bit of an issue between target audience and the type of content that they want to make here, to use some YouTube terms. You said Mark Millar has a tendency to be like really violent in his comics as well. If you look at the Mission Impossible films, the last 3 Mission Impossible movies made 568, 792, and 689 gross at the box office. So we talked about the first Kingsman movie made 414. That's the benchmark here. James Bond movies, the last 3 James Bond movies made 774, 880, and $1.1 billion. Shout out to Skyfall, very good movie.
Yeah, that movie rules.
So when you're comparing it to other large spy movie franchises, it's not doing good. in comparison. It's like at best it's getting the bronze medal right now. So that's the mountain that they're stuck like having to climb up to here. And it appears that they're going down every single movie so far. Now, this whole podcast and this whole argument here is us kind of jumping the gun a little bit in general, right? Because 3 movies from now, 4 movies from now, we're gonna have a much better understanding of like what this franchise is gonna be eventually. But if I had to predict it right now, I think that they're going to keep going down that downward slope and end up like, I don't know, like the DCEU, I feel like would be a good comparison point here, where people might have liked some of the earlier DCEU stuff. And then eventually they were like, oh, this just ain't it, Chief. And, maybe Matthew Vaughn goes on and does Ant-Man 5 in a few years. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see what you're saying. It's hard to argue with the fact that these critical scores are just going down and down. But I would say that track record isn't necessarily indicative of like the potential for this franchise. I think that there's nothing that I saw in Kingsman 2 or The Kingsman that told me that this is dead in the water. I think both of those movies brought a lot of fun ideas to the table, and they were just kind of poorly executed. And when you look at like the production behind The Kingsman and the release of The Kingsman, it struggled quite a bit with the release because of COVID, and then because of it was Fox that made these movies. Okay. So with the buyout of Fox from Disney.
That's very interesting. Yeah, so these are Disney films now.
They're Disney films at this point. That made it more of a challenge. But like with The King's Man, showing us this secret organization of villains from all over history in World War I thought that was a lot of fun. Showing like the world of Kingsman 2 and how people can have robot arms that shoot hands and stuff like that. And there are robot dogs that can be programmed to not attack Elton John. Like these are fun ideas that you're not really gonna be able to implement them in these other spy franchises like Mission Impossible or the more serious James Bond movies, because those movies are a little bit too serious for that type of content. Like this is a throwback to almost like the 70s or 80s James Bond movies where the villains were always over the top. Blofeld really did stroke a kitten on his lap the whole time. And I don't know, I just like that type of world. I think it's a fun, hyper stylized world to play in, and I enjoy it. I do think what you brought up about it being rated R is interesting. I think these are definitely rated R movies that are for younger audiences. So like Matthew Vaughn wants kids sneaking into these movies, I think. I think that's like the target audience is like 15, 16-year-olds that are going to somehow sneak in to see this. And I think that's a lot of fun. I think these are bright, colorful movies that have a really interesting palette and look to them. I enjoyed watching all 3 of them, honestly. The third one, maybe a little rough, but the first 2, it's good. I like the way they look and feel.
So you mentioned earlier that this is kind of a series that people don't really talk about too much. And what do you think would help like bring it more into like the public eye? You think it's Argylle? Do you think Argylle is the key to all of this?
I really don't think Argylle's the key. I would love for Argylle to be the key to this. I don't think it will be. I think that what this just needs to do is cast probably a super established actor as the villain in like Kingsman 3. Someone that people will get excited about, and then also cast maybe an up-and-comer. Like if they were like, oh, Sydney Sweeney is a Kingsman now, I think people would be into that. So if they bring in some new blood and some old blood and give them really interesting roles in these movies, I think that would do it. And then I just think knocking it out of the park is what they need to do. They need to, with either The Kingsman 2 or Kingsman 3, they just have to do a good job to show that this franchise has the juice. And when I look at Matthew Vaughn's track record, there's nothing that precludes him from being a director that can do that. I think he's very talented. I think he just is a guy who has a lot of ideas and maybe puts too much of it on the page and on the screen. So maybe he needs someone reeling him in a little bit. But I don't know. I could see this being successful again.
Yeah, because I think a little bit of the Mission Impossible franchise, where the second one is considered like the low point, which is directed by John Woo, and the way that kind of like brought the series back from the dead a little bit there is they just started making good movies.
Yeah.
They had, J.J. Abrams in his directorial debut with Mission Impossible 3. It's kind of a movie that people think is overrated nowadays. Maybe we'll talk about. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about Mission Impossible in a podcast in the future. But like, you go from that to Ghost Protocol, Road Nation, Fallout, like just good movies. Like they just nail it time and time again. And that's how you get people. That's how you get butts in seats to your movie franchise, is when you set that belief from the audience that this is going to be a good movie that you're watching. That's all people want to see.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I do think that this franchise still has the juice. You know, I'm a little bit like MCU pilled too. I think that if they do these big crossovers with Argylle and the Kick-Ass franchise, you know, I'll be seated. I love that type of bullshit because I'm a simple man.
This is multiverse mania we're living in right now.
So Mark Millar did just publish in 2023 a comic called Big Game that is a crossover between all of his properties, including Kingsman, Kick-Ass, and Wanted. Have you ever seen that? The James McAvoy movie from like...
The one with curving bullets?
Yeah.
Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah, so the main character of that is the villain in this comic book crossover, and he fights Hit Girl and Galahad, and it's very silly. But if they made that and brought it to screen, I would be seated.
So, I will be there.
Yeah, like give it to me. But yeah, I think that to me these are just a lot of fun, and they have like the potential to be a lot more fun if they can just kind of focus up a little bit. That's all I need from Matthew Vaughn is just focus up.
Yeah, they got what?
Nothing. You were just doing this motion under the
I don't know
table.
what you're talking about, man. They need one really good movie.
Yeah.
The first movie is rated 75% on Rotten Tomatoes. Give me one that's like 89%.
Yeah.
Give me one that's like legitimately good, like across the board, that everybody enjoys. That's all we're looking for.
Yeah. I think there's potential for it. Cool. Any other closing arguments from you, Dylan, or closing thoughts?
No, I think we can talk about like what we actually think here. Is it actually overrated, underrated? What do you think the verdict? Where do you think it ultimately comes down to?
It's hard for me to say it's overrated at this point just because people don't really talk about it anymore. So I'm going to stick with underrated. I think
Our line that we drew in the sand of 6 out of 10, I think that realistically is more like a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, so you can go a little...
Considering,
overrated.
yeah, it's a little overrated. It's not a lot overrated, but it's a little overrated.
Yeah, I'll say it's a little underrated just because, like, the technical aspects of this film, the performances that they got, I think there's a lot of good stuff here and stuff that's worthy of, like, praise and celebration. So I'll stick with underrated.
All right, cool.
Cool.
Before we get out of here, there's one thing that we didn't talk about in this podcast that I think is very important for anybody that's watched. Slight spoilers for the Kingsman franchise. Feel free to leave a like and a comment and all that good stuff on the podcast. You guys are free to leave if you don't want to be spoiled a little bit. We need to talk about the technology that makes you survive gunshots to the head.
Yeah, so...
There's one very specific type of gunshot wound that the Kingsman spies are specifically equipped to handle. Actually, no, it's the American, it's the Statesman.
Yeah.
The Statesmen have the technology to bring you back from being shot in the head with a gun.
So in the first film, Harry, who is played by Colin Firth, gets shot in the head, and you're like, that's a wrap on
he's
the
dead.
character.
Yeah. That's like, it is literally any movie franchise is like, that got shot in the head, they're dead.
Yeah. The second movie, about maybe 20, 30 minutes in, they show that Harry is alive. They flash back to the Statesmen, who are the U.S. version of the Kingsmen, going to him, wrapping his head in some sort of gel thing, and then nanites shooting into his head and fixing his brain and taking the bullet out. And then he's all better.
So here was our pitch for what they should do in future Kingsman movies is just keep adding more and more random movie technologies that allow you to survive even more increasingly ridiculous like ways to die.
Yeah, I think in the second movie there's a character who gets blown up, and we were like, oh, don't worry, he's gonna go to Kingsman, China, and they have the technology to cure that.
Yeah, they put him through a machine that reconstructs you.
Yeah. And then another guy, he gets put through a meat grinder, and we were like, don't worry, Kingsman Germany's got you covered there.
They have the un-meat grinder machine. And then you can put them all together. You can have a guy who gets shot in the head, then put through a meat grinder. Don't worry, fam, we got you.
Yeah, see, I think this addresses that scaling problem you brought up. As long as there are more countries for the Kingsmen to go to, they can always go bigger and better with their technology.
It is funny that Now, because the series, since we're talking spoilers here, this series does have a tendency to kill off characters a lot, which is one thing I find vaguely interesting. And it's almost like a box that they paint themselves into because they're like, well, we can't have a guy get killed by getting shot in the head because we wrote in this plot device so that they don't die when that happens.
It's so weird. I don't know. I like it though. It feels comic booky to have these characters basically be able to escape any situation.
Oh, absolutely! It's like the back to tanks in Star Wars. It's just like toss them in the medicine juice. We'll fix them up.
Cool. Well, I think that's going to be it for us talking about the Kingsman franchise. Let us know in the comments. Did we get it right? What would you like to see us cover in future episodes? Thanks for watching. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube.
And Patreon. Hit up our Patreon.
Yeah, well, yeah.
$2, the lowest tier. Come on, guys.
Give us money, yeah.
Jason's dying over here.
I'm sick.
He needs to pay for his tea.
I need to pay for medical insurance. Yeah, what else? Discord, right?
Yeah, we do have a Discord.
Join our Discord.
Yeah, come back on our Discord. We have convos in there.
We could have better combos in there.
Yeah, we gotta get on that.
Yeah, but yeah, this was fun. Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. We will see you guys at the movies.
Goodbye.